The mountain road was quiet that morning, wrapped in a blanket of early fog that clung to the trees like ghostly fingers. Only the faint chirp of distant birds and the gentle rustling of leaves filled the silence, until a hiker's gasp cut through the calm. At the edge of a narrow curve, deep in a pine-covered pass, a car lay crushed in a ditch. The metal frame was barely recognizable, contorted like paper under some unimaginable force. Glass shimmered on the ground, and steam still hissed faintly from what used to be the hood. It looked like no one could have survived, but that wasn't the only strange thing. Sitting next to the wreck, unmoving, like a statue carved by sorrow, was a large brown bear. His massive body rose and fell slowly with breath. He wasn't eating. He wasn't searching for food. He wasn't even startled by the humans who eventually approached. He just sat and stared. His eyes, deep and unreadable, stayed locked on the mangled vehicle. It didn't make sense. When the hikers first saw him, they paused at a distance, unsure if he was dangerous. But minutes passed, then an hour, then 2, and the bear didn't move. Occasionally, he would sniff at the wreck or pace beside it in tight circles, then return to the same spot and sit down again, head slightly lowered, expression strangely mournful. Word spread quickly. A few people took shaky cell phone videos from afar and posted them online. Bear won't leave car wreck. WTH is going on? He's guarding something. This is not normal behavior. Within a few hours, park rangers and wildlife officers arrived. They approached with caution, trained in how to handle potentially dangerous encounters with large predators. But what they saw wasn't a bear acting territorial. There were no warning huffs, no charges, no displays of aggression. Instead, he sat quietly, even as they inched closer. When they tried to draw him away by setting out food or making noise, he finally stood, moved back a few paces, but then circled right back to the exact spot beside the passenger door, as if he were waiting for someone to open it. It rattled the officers. One of them, Ranger Torres, whispered to his colleague, "I don't think this is about food. This bear's waiting for something or someone." A decision was made. They would monitor the situation while waiting for tranquilizers. They couldn't get close enough to inspect the car without sedating the bear, and there was growing concern. Was something, or someone, inside that wreck? As more people arrived, one volunteer launched a drone above the scene. From the sky, the footage was haunting. The crushed car looked impossibly small compared to the looming forest around it. The bear, a lone, unmoving figure, sat right beside the mangled side door, like a grief-stricken sentinel keeping watch over the dead. The drone captured his slow pacing, his low grunts, the way he occasionally pressed his snout against the broken window. It was raw, emotional. The video went viral within hours. This bear is acting like a father at a grave. There's no way this is random behavior. Something's in that car. By now, daylight had broken fully through the trees. A team of vets had arrived with tranquilizer darts. The bear still hadn't left. He hadn't tried to run or lash out, even with dozens of humans nearby. He just stayed. The moment the darts struck him, softly, in the hind leg, he let out a low groan. But even then, there was no fury, no fight, only resignation. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his body sank to the forest floor. His eyes fluttered once toward the wreck, and closed. Everyone went silent. No one cheered, no one spoke. Then, carefully, the team approached the car. The damage was horrifying. Steel folded over like tinfoil, the front end crushed against a pine stump, the roof half caved in. Using metal cutters and crowbars, they began peeling the wreck apart. The doors groaned, refusing to give easily. It took minutes, painful, slow minutes, before one side finally broke loose with a sharp snap. As it opened, a thick silence fell again. Inside, they saw twisted seatbelts, broken glass, and torn upholstery. And then, a sound, so soft it could have been missed. A faint, high-pitched cry. Everyone froze. The lead officer leaned in, heart racing. His flashlight swept across the wreckage, then landed on a small shape, wedged beneath the front seat, half hidden under debris and dirt. It moved. Tiny. Trembling. A bear cub. Eyes closed, chest barely rising, covered in dust and tiny cuts, but alive. The officers stared in disbelief. The bear hadn't been guarding wreckage. He had been guarding his child. And no one, not the hikers, not the officers, not even the vets, could speak as the truth hit them all at once. He had waited. For hours. In silence. In sorrow. In hope. Because inside that crushed car, his cub still breathed. The air inside the wrecked car was heavy, like time itself had stopped there. Smoke had long since faded, but the stench of scorched upholstery and gasoline lingered. The officers moved carefully, tools in hand, hearts pounding. One flashlight beam swept across the floor, catching twisted seat frames and dangling wires. Another pointed toward the dashboard, crumpled against the shattered glass. Then, just as hope began to fade, there it was. A whimper, barely audible. A second later, it came again. Faint. Frightened. Alive. Everyone froze. A vet dropped to her knees, peering under the collapsed front seat. There, trapped beneath a tangle of metal and debris, was a cub, no larger than a house cat. Her fur was matted with blood and dirt. One of her back legs twitched feebly. Her ribs moved with shallow, uneven breaths. "She's alive," the vet whispered. "Oh my God, she's still breathing." No one dared speak too loudly, afraid that even a breath might fracture this fragile moment. Gloved hands worked quickly but delicately. Each piece of twisted metal was moved with extreme caution. The cub's small frame was wedged so tightly that even the slightest wrong pull could cause permanent damage, or worse. Someone brought a soft towel. Another prepped oxygen and IV supplies. The lead officer radioed ahead. "We've got a living cub. Request emergency medical transport. Critical condition." As they slowly freed her, they noticed her tiny body trembled involuntarily. She was severely dehydrated. Her eyes fluttered but didn't fully open. Her breathing was labored and her limbs limp. Still, she was alive. And that realization hit them all like a freight train. That bear. He wasn't just loitering near wreckage. He was her father, watching over her, protecting her, refusing to leave no matter how many people came near, no matter how tired or afraid he might have been. Hours. He had waited for hours in stillness beside that wreck, not for his own sake, but for hers. As the team finally pulled her free and wrapped her in a heated blanket, one of the rangers turned away and wiped his eyes. Another muttered, "I've never seen anything like this. Not in all my years." The cub was rushed to the waiting wildlife rescue van. Inside, 2 emergency veterinarians worked frantically to stabilize her. Oxygen mask, fluids, glucose injection. Her vitals were dangerously low, her body temperature even lower. Then came the questions. How long had she been trapped there? And what had actually happened? Back at the crash site, investigators scanned the vehicle. They found shredded fur in the front passenger seat and a large blood stain. A tragic confirmation. A third bear had been in the vehicle. The mother. Dashcam fragments and nearby tire tracks painted a grim picture. Sometime during the night, the car had likely been struck head-on by a truck around a tight blind curve. The vehicle had flipped once, landed hard, and pinned itself against the tree line. The mother bear hadn't survived. The father had escaped, possibly thrown from the back of the car or able to push his way out. But instead of running, as any wild animal would, he had returned, to watch over the cub who remained trapped. Not for minutes, not even just 1 hour, but for over 10 hours, unmoving, waiting in the fog. It was heartbreaking, but it was also something else, unthinkably rare. Male bears don't stay. In the wild, male bears rarely show signs of paternal instinct. They wander, roam. Some even pose risks to cubs. But this bear, He had defied instinct. He had chosen loyalty over fear, compassion over survival. Back in the rescue van, the cub's condition remained critical. Her tiny lungs rattled with every breath. Her limbs remained motionless. Vets monitored her constantly, praying for stabilization. Meanwhile, miles away, the father lay in sedation at a wildlife containment facility. He had been tagged, checked, and isolated. Still unconscious, still unaware. Unaware that his daughter was now fighting for her life. Unaware that the mission he clung to, through pain, hunger, and confusion, had not been in vain. As the van sped toward the Emergency Wildlife Care Center, the youngest vet on board, a woman named Ava, kept her hand gently on the cub's side. "She's still breathing," she whispered. "Come on, little one. Keep fighting." The hours that followed were filled with uncertainty. Emergency surgery to relieve internal swelling. IV lines threaded into impossibly tiny veins. A warm incubator to mimic a mother's warmth. They named her Willow, for the way she had bent but not broken. But her condition remained unstable. Her survival was not guaranteed. And as the final shot of the section lingers, we see two heartbreaking images. Willow, trembling in her incubator, eyes still closed. Her father, sedated and alone, lying on a cold concrete floor under flickering lights, both fighting, both waiting, and neither knowing if the other would make it. The sterile light of the Emergency Wildlife Center flickered against silver equipment and transparent tubes. Inside a small sealed incubator, the cub lay motionless, her chest rising only slightly, her tiny paw twitching every few minutes. She was a fragile tangle of fur and wires, held together by pure will and the desperate determination of the people around her. Vets and techs moved quickly, whispering, not wanting to disturb the air already heavy with dread. "Internal bleeding confirmed," Ava said quietly, and her glucose levels just dropped again. "Start another IV," the senior vet replied. "We're losing her minute by minute." Hope, now officially named by the rescue team after a wave of online support, was clinging to life by a thread. The sun had set hours ago, but no one dared sleep. Not tonight. Through the glass of the incubator, her body was visibly trembling. Her breathing came in uneven gasps, the kind that made machines beep sharply and hearts stop momentarily. The monitors beside her showed fluctuating numbers, oxygen levels, heart rate, temperature, all unstable. The vet team had done everything they could. Warm fluids, mild sedation to keep her calm, antibiotics, pain management, but her body had endured too much. If she didn't stabilize by dawn, she wouldn't make it. Across the facility, in a concrete holding enclosure under dim emergency lights, the father bear stirred. He had been sedated for nearly 12 hours. Now his body tensed as the medication wore off. His eyes blinked open slowly, unfocused at first, then sharp. He sniffed the air. Something was wrong. He stood, heavy and slow at first, then more urgently. He walked to the edge of the pen, sniffing, then back, then forward again. His nose lifted higher, testing the unfamiliar smells of the facility. Then came the sound. A low, haunting whine. He paced, back and forth, not with aggression but with anxious urgency. He stopped only to let out another soft grunt, almost like a question, directed at no one and nothing. Guards watched from a distance, silent. One of them whispered, "He's looking for her." They had seen wild bears wake in captivity before. Usually they panicked, or attacked the enclosure, or sulked silently in corners. But this bear was doing none of that. He wasn't angry. He was worried. The videos of him pacing, sniffing the bars, glancing toward the hallway where the vet team had disappeared hours earlier, started to circulate online. And just like before, the internet reacted instantly. He's a father. He knows she's nearby. That's not an animal, that's a parent. We don't deserve them. Donations poured into the Wildlife Center. Comments, prayers, art, letters. People all over the world were watching now. Hope, the cub, had become a symbol, not just of survival, but of something deeper, something pure, that, in the wildest corners of nature, compassion still bloomed. Inside the ICU, the night dragged on. At 2:47 a.m., Hope's vitals dropped suddenly. Her heart rate flatlined for a second. Just 1 second, but long enough to make everyone freeze. Clear the airway. Push epinephrine. The room burst into motion again. Tiny chest compressions. Oxygen. The monitor blinked and beeped erratically. Then, miraculously, it picked up again. Weak, but steady. No one spoke. They just stared, hearts in throats. At 3:12 a.m., her breathing slowed again. Her body went frighteningly still. Ava reached through the access port in the incubator, her gloved hand gently resting on the cub's side. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered. "Not yet. Not after everything." Minutes passed. Then the faintest flicker of motion. Hope's paw twitched. Her breath rasped in again. She was still fighting. The team pressed on through the darkness, watching for any sign she might stabilize. Meanwhile, in his pen, the father didn't sleep. He remained on his feet, pacing softly, occasionally pressing his forehead against the bars. Low, breathy whines escaped him now and then. Not calls, not warnings, just sorrow. One of the overnight staff sat nearby. She turned on her phone screen and opened a live stream of the ICU. She held it up where the bear could see. Not that he understood the technology, but maybe the sound of beeping, the quiet voices, the light. Maybe it meant something. He didn't react at first, but then he paused, sniffed the air again, and let out a low, mournful huff. The kind of sound that could only come from waiting too long for someone you love. The emotional weight of it all was unbearable, punished only by the fact that everyone, animal and human alike, was powerless in that moment. The night grew colder. The vet team began to rotate shifts, taking 5-minute breaks before returning to Hope's side. Outside, the first hint of morning light began to bleed into the sky. Pale blue, barely visible through the high windows of the facility. It wasn't over, not yet. Hope's breathing was shallow, but steady. Her heartbeat, fragile as it was, remained. Her internal bleeding had slowed. The oxygen mask stayed snug around her muzzle, and as the camera panned out, viewers around the world watched with held breath. A cub, silent in her incubator. A father, standing in the shadows, still waiting, still hoping. The first golden rays of dawn slipped through the Wildlife Center's high windows, casting long, warm beams across the sterile tiles. Inside the ICU, the quiet beep of monitors held steady for the first time in hours. Hope had survived the night. Her tiny chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. A flicker of movement returned to her limbs. Her ears twitched at the sound of voices. Her tongue reached weakly toward the dropper of glucose water Ava offered. A miracle. No one dared say the word aloud, afraid it might jinx the fragile thread they'd fought so hard to hold. But behind every relieved breath, every cautious smile, it echoed louder than the machines. She made it. At first, Hope could barely lift her head. But as the morning unfolded, so did she. Her eyes opened, cloudy but alert. She blinked slowly, squinting toward the blurred shapes beyond the glass. Ava gently stroked her fur through a gloved port. "Welcome back, little fighter." In another wing of the center, the father bear stood motionless. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. He barely drank. He paced less now, just stood near the metal door that led away from his pen, staring at it like he knew something waited beyond it. The staff couldn't ignore it any longer. "We have to try," Ava said. "He's not acting like a wild bear. Not now. He's grieving." It was risky. Letting a massive, unpredictable male bear near his injured cub, especially in a clinical setting, could end in disaster. But this bear had defied every expectation from the beginning. So they prepared. Thick plexiglass barrier. Emergency sedation on standby. 2 teams watching from above and behind protective glass. They wheeled Hope's incubator into a large enclosure just beside the glass partition. She was still weak, but her head lifted slightly. She blinked toward the noise. Then they brought him in. The father stepped forward slowly, hesitantly, sniffing the unfamiliar ground. His eyes darted around, then locked onto the glass. Behind it, a tiny bundle of brown fur. He moved forward, cautiously. No growl, no bared teeth, no panic. Just focus. He pressed his nose gently to the barrier. A long, low chuff escaped his throat, soft, uncertain, filled with something that sounded like a question. Hope stirred. Her body shifted weakly. She let out the faintest cry. Another chuff from him, this one higher, urgent. The vets watched, frozen. No one blinked. Then Ava nodded. "Open the gate." They slid the glass aside, just enough for monitored contact. The father hesitated, just for a breath, then stepped through. He approached the small bundle, careful, almost reverent. He lowered himself slowly to the ground. His massive frame curled sideways, giving space, lowering his head so his eyes met hers. Hope lifted her paw. It trembled, barely able to move, but reached out. And then, magic. She inched forward, collapsing softly against his thick fur. Her nose buried into his chest. His paw, twice the size of her entire body, wrapped gently over her. Not tight, not possessive, just protective. A silent embrace. Gasps echoed from behind the glass. One staff member quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Another filmed with shaking hands. The footage would go viral within minutes. But in that moment, no one cared about views. They were witnessing something sacred. He stayed like that for over an hour, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Hope drifted into shallow sleep, tucked into the safest place she had ever known. And he kept watch, just like he had at the wreck. Wildlife experts were stunned. "He shouldn't be like this," one murmured. "Male bears don't do this. They just don't." But this one had. From the moment of the crash, through sedation, captivity, and now recovery, he had chosen to stay, chosen to protect, chosen to love. In the days that followed, Hope gained strength. Her limp faded. Her eyes grew clearer. She began to walk, wobbly at first, then steadier with each hour, always close to her father. The team decided they couldn't separate them. Offers came in from reserves across the country. One, a sprawling protected sanctuary in the Rockies, offered a dedicated space, rich forests, secure perimeter, and minimal human contact. Perfect. The plan was made. As soon as both were strong enough, they'd be released together. On the morning of their departure, Ava entered the enclosure one last time. Hope approached her, curious and cautious. Ava crouched down and extended her hand. "You did good, little girl," she whispered. "You both did." Then the gates opened. The crate doors swung wide into a rolling meadow at the edge of the sanctuary. Beyond it, hills dipped into wooded slopes bathed in sunlight. Hope stepped out first, sniffing the air, eyes wide. The father followed close behind, his pace measured, gaze fixed forward. They paused at the crest of a small hill. The cub sat down. The bear sat beside her. Together they stared into the wild that waited. The camera zoomed out, just far enough to catch the silhouette of 2 figures, side by side, staring into the horizon. Not as survivors, as family. As the screen faded to black, one line appeared. He waited beside her wreckage for hours. Now, she walks beside him into the future.